welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about a somewhat contentious topic in the TTRPG sphere, and something that I personally don't have a ton of experience with in Pathfinder, and that is counterspelling. So for the purposes of this video, I am going to define a counterspell as an effect or an ability that allows you to counteract something that's going to happen to you before it actually happens, i.e. during the process of casting. This is obviously going to include the literal counterspell, but it's also going to include a couple of things you might not think of at first glance, and that I'll cover later. But before we can understand counterspells, we first have to understand how counteracting works in PF2. Counteracting is a relatively complicated rule set, especially in comparison to a lot of the other rules in the system, but once you boil it down and understand it, I find it's actually not too difficult to put into practice. So when you counteract something, in essence, you make a counteract check against the thing you're counteracting, and then you compare your counteract level of your check versus the effect that you're attempting to counteract to see if you actually counteract it. Now, counteracting is kind of a universal rule that's applied in a lot of different areas of the system. So depending on what exactly you're counteracting, whether that be a disease, a poison, or a spell, the exact way to calculate the counteract check and the counteract levels is going to change. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on spell counteracting, since that's obviously what we're looking at counterspells. So for spells, when you cast a counterspell, you make a spellcasting ability check, which is usually just going to be your spell attack modifier, against the opponent's spell DC. This is your counteract check, and the degrees of success will determine what level of spell you are allowed to counteract. If you have a critical success on your counteract check, you can counteract a spell effect that is up to 3 levels higher than your effect's counteract level. So for example, if you counterspell at 3rd level, you can counteract a spell effect up to 6th level. If you succeed on the counteract check, you counteract spells up to 1 level higher than your counteract level, and if you fail on the counteract check, you still counteract spells lower than your counteract level. It is only on a critical failure where you 100% fail to counteract the target. Something important to note is that if you attempt to counterspell with a spell level higher than your opponent's spell level, even if you fail, you will still counteract that spell. So it's important, if possible, to counteract with spell levels higher than the effect that you're trying to counteract. In this way, even if you fail, you counteract the spell, and even if the counteract DC is very hard for your level, you're going to be incredibly likely to successfully counteract, because all you need to do is avoid a critical failure. Now that we understand counteracting, let's look at counterspell itself. Available at 1st level to sorcerers, witches, and wizards. As a reaction, if a creature casts a spell that you've prepared, or if you're a sorcerer, a spell that you have in your repertoire, you can attempt to counteract it. To do so, you must expend a spell slot as if you had cast the spell yourself. Meaning for a witch or a wizard, you must expend the prepared spell that you cast, or for a sorcerer, you must lose a spell slot that you could use to cast that spell. Once you do so, you can attempt to counteract the triggering spell, following the counteract rules that we just went over. As an example, let's say a foe casts Fireball at you, and you want to counterspell it before it takes effect. If you're a witch or wizard, you would have had to prepare Fireball that morning, and if you did, you would be allowed to lose one of your prepared Fireballs as if you had cast it. If you're a sorcerer, instead, you must know Fireball in your repertoire, and also be able to expend a spell slot of a level in which you could cast Fireball at. Let's say you are able to cast 3rd level Fireballs, either because you prepared Fireball in a 3rd level slot as a witch or wizard, or you know 3rd level Fireball in your repertoire as a sorcerer. and that your opponent casts Fireball at 4th level. You would make a spellcasting ability check, which is usually going to be your spell attack modifier, against your opponent's spell DC. And referring to the counteract rules here, in order to counteract a spell level 1 level higher than yours, you would have to at least succeed on your counteract check in order to successfully counterspell the Fireball. Of note is the spell tradition used to cast the spell does not need to match your spellcasting tradition. It just needs to be the same spell. So for example, even if a primal caster was casting Fireball at you, as an arcane caster like a witch or a wizard, or even as a non-primal sorcerer, you would still be allowed to counteract that Fireball, assuming you could cast Fireball yourself. The only requirement is that the spell being cast is the same as the spell that you expend, not that the tradition matches. Now you might think that's all well and good, but how will we know what spell is being cast in order to actually counterspell it? Well, lucky for us, Paizo gives us rules on identifying spells and explicitly tells us that if we see a spell being cast and the spell is one that we have prepared or is in our repertoire, we automatically know what that spell is. And importantly, we also know what level it is being heightened to. What this means is that at least with a basic counterspell, if we are able to counterspell, we are guaranteed to know what the spell that is being cast is. And additionally, we know what level the spell is being cast at, so that we can make an informed choice on what spell slot level we want to expend in our counterspell attempt. So now that we have the basics of counterspell covered, let's move on to the rest of the counterspell options in PF2. Starting with Reflect Spell level 14, available to the original Sorcerer, Witch, and Wizard. This allows you, when you counterspell, to actually turn the spell back against its caster, effectively forcing them to cast the spell on themselves. One caveat is that area spells will only affect the original caster, so even if you turn back a fireball, the fireball will be contained to only that caster and not bloom out to all of their friends standing next to them. But it's still a good way to give opponents a taste of their own medicine. Next up we have Clever Counterspell, available at level 12 exclusively to wizards. This allows us, instead of having to expend a spell that precisely matches the spell being cast, to expend a spell with a matching non-tradition trait, with the caveat that we still need the spell being cast inside of our spellbook. So, for example, if a foe casts Fireball at us, instead of having to counterspell with precisely Fireball, we would be able to counterspell with a different spell with a fire trait, like, for example, Wall of Fire. Note, however, that schools are a non-tradition trait that spells have. So, if a foe is casting Fireball, we could choose any evocation spell that we have prepared and expend it to counteract that Fireball. Do note that you get a -2 penalty on your counteract check, but this is well worth it for the insane flexibility that Clever Counterspell gives you. Now, instead of having to prepare the precise spell that your opponent will be casting against you, you can just copy as many spells as you can into your spellbook, and then prepare a medley of spells with a variety of traits in order to counterspell basically anything that could possibly come your way. Before we move on from the classes, I want to really quick cover Counter Thought available to Psychics. At level 1, this is basically Clever Counterspell, but restricted to the mental trait, allowing you to counteract mental spells with mental spells of your own. Obviously, this is much more restrictive than the standard counterspell, especially for the second class because they have less spell slots than a normal full caster would. But being able to counteract any mental spell with other mental spells is a powerful ability, as we just covered in Clever Counterspell. And of note, mental spells are some of the scariest spells in the game, including powerful debuffs like Fear and Low Level, and, more, more importantly, the mind control spells like Dominate at higher levels. Moving on to the archetypes, we start with Captivator, which is essentially an enchantment and illusion specialist. At level 8, they gain Counter Charm, which allows them to counterspell enchantment and illusion spells with their own innate enchantment and illusion spells. The Captivator spells they get from the archetype do count as occult innate spells, so really what this restriction is doing is saying that you can't use spell slots from your normal class to help counterspell. So, for example, even if you are a bard, you still couldn't use your bard slots to counter charm, and you would have to use Captivator spell slots instead. At level 10, Captivators also gain access to Reactive Charm, which allows you, if you are targeted by a spell or attack, to, as a reaction, cast a first level enchantment spell on the instigating creature. While this is not a traditional counterspell in that you actually aren't making any counteract checks, this still takes place before the effect occurs, and, as called out in the text, if the effect succeeds, then the creature might decide to do something different than what they were planning. The example they give is if you charm the attacker and they become friendly to you, they might change the target of their attack or even decline to attack entirely. Next up we have the Spellmaster, which is an uncommon archetype specific to the Pathfinder organization. At level 16 they gain Master's Counterspell, which is kind of a weird hybrid between the normal Counterspell and Cleric Counterspell. It still requires you to have the spell that is being cast prepared or in your repertoire, and also has the additional requirement that it actually matches your tradition. However, you don't need to expend the exact same spell to counteract. If you have the spell prepared or in your repertoire, you can expend any spell slot that you have available to attempt to counteract it, even if that spell slot wasn't dedicated to the same spell that was being cast at you. Next up is the Rare Runelord archetype. This is a class dedication for the wizard, which emphasizes the school specialization. At level 12 they gain School Counterspell, which allows them to counterspell spells of their school specialization with spells of a matching school instead of only the spell that is being cast. So, for example, if the Rune Lord is an evocation specialist, if your opponent casts an evocation spell like Fireball, the Rune Lord will be able to counterspell with any evocation spell they have prepared instead of specifically Fireball. At level 18, the ruler gains School Spell Redirection, which allows, if they critically succeed at the counteract check, or succeed while using a spell of the higher level that they are attempting to counteract, to actually redirect the countered spell. This allows the Rune Lord to act effectively as if they had cast the spell themselves, choosing the targets and using their spell DCs, attack rolls, etc. For our last archetype, we have the Rare Wellspring Mage. This is a class dedication restricted to classes that cast with a spell repertoire, such as sorcerers. It is sort of PF2's take on Wild Magic from D&D 5th edition, and at level 12 they gain access to Interfering Surge, which allows them to counterspell any spell with no restrictions. There are a couple caveats to this. If the spell you're attempting to counterspell is in your repertoire and you expended a spell slot at least as high a level as it, you take no penalties. However, if either of those conditions are not true, you take a -2 if the triggering spell was in the same magical tradition that you use. If none of the above is true, then you take a -5 penalty to your counteract check. Moving on to the skill feats, and the first two I want to discuss are Recognize Spell and Quick Recognition. Recognize Spell at level 1 allows you as a reaction to attempt to recognize a spell being cast if it's not prepared or in your spell repertoire. And Quick Recognition at level 7 allows you to recognize spell once per round for free if you are a master in the appropriate skill. Now these obviously aren't super relevant, you're just using the normal counterspell, since as we discussed, if you can counterspell, you will guaranteed recognize the spell. Where this is relevant is from something like Clever Counterspell or the Interfering Surge, where you will be counterspelling things that are not necessarily in your prepared list or in your spell repertoire. The other skill feat I want to cover is Skeptic's Defense at level 7. This is an uncommon feat which allows us to counteract mental spells using our intimidation for the check. And finally, I want to cover the non-fiend counterspell options available in the system. Starting with Reflecting Shard, which is a talisman affixed to a shield, and allows you as a reaction to attempt to reflect targeted spells that are coming at you, using your athletics modifier for the counteract check. Next up we have the uncommon spell Non-Detection. Not a traditional counterspell, it still attempts to counteract all sorts of divination attempts on the target before they can actually take effect, meaning it still counts under the definition that I put together at the beginning of this video. Next we have Spell Immunity, which is essentially a ward that you place on a creature for a day and attempts to protect them from a single named spell. For example, you could cast Spell Immunity, naming Domination on a ally, and whenever someone attempts to dominate that ally, they would first have to get through the counteract check of your Spell Immunity. Next we have the uncommon Spell Turning, and its rare item version, the Ring of Spell Turning. This is actually an hour-long buff, which allows you as a reaction to attempt to reflect spells that target you, similar to the Reflecting Shard that we covered earlier. And finally we have Nullify, which is a 10th level spell which automatically counteracts any spell a foe casts that is 9th level or lower. You do take a little bit of feedback damage, but otherwise this is a no holds barred, no caveat counterspell. So, as always, I want to end the video with a little sample build of how I would create a counterspell focused character. So it's going to be pretty simple. This is just go wizard and then take the 3 counterspell feats, counterspell itself, clever counterspell, which really expands our ability to counterspell, and reflect spell. By level 12, when we have clever counterspell, we'll also want to have had picked up recognize spell and quick recognition, which allows us to actually take advantage of being able to counterspell things that we have not prepared. This also means that we'll likely want to put our skill increases into the spell tradition skills, Arcana, Nature, Occultism, and Religion, so that we can actually quick recognize as many spells as possible. Now there is some argument for going Sorcerer, because Interfering Surge from the Wellspring Mage is really good as essentially the only no restriction counterspell other than the 10th level spell Nullify. And in addition, we get a little extra synergy with Skeptic's Defense, the skill feat, because Intimidation and Sorcerer both key off of Charisma. However, I don't think this is the route I want to go with, because up until level 12, we're relying on plain old Counterspell, and wizards with their prepared spell list, as opposed to sorcerers with their repertoire, are going to have a lot of flexibility in being able to target what spells they want to be able to counterspell that day. Now before I end the video, I want to spend a little time going over some caveats if you want to focus in on counterspelling. First and most obviously, if your foes aren't actually casting spells at you, then counterspell is just a wasted feat. Secondly, even if our foes are regularly casting spells at us, at least until level 12 in Clever Counterspell, we're going to need to have the exact spell prepared that day in order to counterspell. With that being the case, we really need a campaign and a GM who regularly throws spellcasters at us to fight, and also either telegraph their fights or allow us downtime to investigate who we're facing in order to really get the most out of these feats. But finally, I want to not discount the value of a good old Dispel Magic. Not only is it going to be more helpful in out-of-combat scenarios, where you're more likely going to want to get through a magically locked door than counterspell someone's fireball, they're also going to be much more relevant when dealing with things like abjurative or buffing spells. And in addition, dispelling magic is much more widely available than counterspelling is. The titular's dispel magic is available to every spellcasting tradition, but a number of classes also have feats that they can take which allow them to dispel effects on their opponent. For example, Dispelling Spellstrike for the Magus or Sunderspell for the Barbarian both do these things, but a number of classes have similar feats available to them. So that's all for this week's video. I've never really engaged with counterspelling in PF2, and so it was interesting to do this deep dive and see exactly how Paizo has decided to implement it in the game. So I hope you enjoyed coming on this journey to me, and that you'll come back next time to see what I have in store. But most importantly, I hope you have a lovely day.